If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you're either a guy who's interested in sewing, you identify as a guy and you're interested in sewing, or your sewing interests lie in what might be considered more masculine pursuits than, say, quilting or making a lace doily. But whoever you are, if you can learn something from this, everybody's welcome. So I got into sewing a long time ago, a few years ago, and I had the benefit of my wife already knowing how to sew, so I learned a lot from her. But if you're interested in it and maybe don't have someone close to you who sews, the sewing machine might seem like a great mystery. And just like a MIG welder or a table saw or anything else, it's a tool, and you can learn how to use it and how to maintain it pretty easily. You just need somebody maybe to show you what it's all about. The type of sewing machine that I'm going to be discussing today is the single needle lock stitch machine. When you think sewing machine, that's probably the sewing machine that comes into mind. So I'm going to show you several different single needle lock stitch machines and talk about some of the differences and also how they're all actually very similar. First, we'll take a look at some of the different machines that I currently have. First off is my prized Singer Featherweight. This belonged to my grandmother. It's a 1936 machine. It made all of my mother's clothes through high school, and it sat in its case for probably several decades, and I plugged it in and started sewing with it. It works fine. I don't use it very much. It's sort of an heirloom more than a item that I use often, but quilters love these things. They're actually quite valuable on the market. If you see one at a yard sale for $50, I would buy it immediately. But anyway, that's the Featherweight. If you've watched any of my older videos, this is the machine that I used for the first several years of my sewing interests. This is a 1987 Kenmore. It's actually made by a company called Janome, a Japanese sewing machine company with the Kenmore name. It's a plastic case machine, kind of on the newer end of what I would be interested in because I happen to like older machines. That's the machine I cut my sewing teeth on. Off in the background there, I'm not going to get too close to it because it costs too much money, is my wife's machine. I generally stay away from it. It's a machine that's designed primarily for quilting. It has lots of electronic controls, an automatic thread cutter, who knows how many stitches. That machine cost twice what I paid for my running and driving Porsche 944, so I don't touch it. And over in the sweatshop corner of the sewing studio, I have my latest pride and joy, my Pfaff 260 in the foreground, and in the background the $13 Singer Touch and Sew, which may still be my favorite. All these machines are very, very similar, but they all have differences that make them more or less desirable in some ways, or more or less useful for different things. But basically any one of these machines can sew useful items for you and probably last you for many years before you might find the need to jump up to something more capable. For price comparison, the Touch and Sew, as I said, I paid $13 for it at a thrift store. The Pfaff was about $150, and then I put another $150 in having it basically completely rebuilt. So I've got about $300 into that machine. So now I want to talk about some of the common elements among the different styles of this kind of machine and the basics of how you use one. Starting on the right side of the machine, if you're facing the machine, is the hand wheel. And you'll notice that when you operate the machine, that wheel turns. And even if you go in reverse, that wheel always turns in the same direction, and the mechanism that does the sewing always goes in the same direction. You don't ever want to turn the wheel in the opposite direction from the direction it normally turns. You can screw up the timing of the machine, and if you don't know how to fix that, it could be an expensive repair. So it always turns towards you as you're sitting in front of the machine. On top of the machine, usually in this general area, you'll find a pin that's designed to hold your spool of thread that feeds the top stitch of the machine. You'll notice on this machine I'm running with an industrial size spool on a separate spool stand, and you can do that with most machines. I'm just using this because I have a much larger spool of thread to draw from, but you can run the machine either way. This particular machine has 2 spool pins and is capable of running a twin needle, which has 2 needles side by side to do the kind of stitching you might see on the leg of your jeans with 2 parallel stitches. But I haven't used that yet, so I don't have a twin needle. On this particular machine, on the top of the machine is the mechanism for winding the bobbin. The bobbin is the spool that holds the thread for the bottom of the stitch. With this kind of machine, the stitch is made up of 2 separate threads that interlock, and we'll talk more about bobbins in a moment. But to wind thread on your bobbin, most machines have some sort of mechanism to allow you to wind the bobbin. Otherwise you'd have to do it by hand. So, and why not demonstrate that right now? On this particular machine, there's a knob to release a clutch so that the sewing mechanism doesn't operate while you're winding the bobbin. And then once the bobbin is wound, it kicks off this lever and stops the process. Now let's talk about threading the machine. I'm just going to go through the threading procedure for this machine to give you an overview of how most sewing machines are threaded. There are going to be small differences between models, but this will give you a general idea. Again, this is a Pfaff 260, so if you happen to have one, then this will show you how to thread it. Coming off of either the thread stand or the spool on the machine, there's a thread guide on the top. And basically the idea of all the thread guides that you'll find on various sewing machines is just to get the thread to the needle in an organized way so it doesn't get tangled and it has the proper tension. It's the second thread guide here, and again you can see there are 2 in the event that you're running twin needle. This guide here has 2 holes, and I've found that if I go through both, it works well. There's probably a number of different correct ways to thread a sewing machine, depending on the machine, and there may be a number of incorrect ways that work okay. This assembly has tension discs, and they're responsible for maintaining the correct tension. So you have to get the thread in between the discs, and then there's a spring that the thread hooks onto. And then through a hole in the lifting arm, then the thread goes through another thread guide, and then yet another thread guide, and yet another thread guide. Now to thread the needle, it's easier if you put the foot down. There's a lifting arm on the back of most commercial home sewing machines. You might find if you have an industrial machine or a machine that's equipped with one, there's also a knee lift that operates underneath the table for the foot. But for the vast majority of home-based machines, there will be a lever on the back of the machine, maybe on the side. But when you're threading the needle, if you have the lifting arm raised all the way to the top, which you do via the wheel on the side, and lower the presser foot, then you can get better access to the needle. Home sewing machines are virtually always set up so that the needle goes in, so that the hole that the thread goes through is facing you, so you go from front to back. And if you're old like me and have trouble seeing up close, it helps if you have plenty of light. Makes it easier. Then you lift the foot. There's a notch in the presser foot. Thread goes back, and that's how you thread the top of the machine for the upper thread. The bobbin is underneath the machine, and there are several different configurations. You can have bobbins that load underneath from the front, from the side, from the top. The bobbin may just drop into an integrated case, or in the case of this particular machine, which is a front-loading bobbin, the case is removable. So you have your bobbin, which has thread on it, as I showed, and then the bobbin case that holds it in place. If you forget to put in the bobbin, or more commonly, when your bobbin runs out of thread while you're sewing, you won't actually be sewing. You'll be punching holes in your fabric, but no actual sewing will take place. So it's important to make sure that you have plenty of thread on your bobbin before you start your project, and monitor it as you go along to make sure you haven't run out. For this machine, the bobbin goes into the bobbin case, and the thread goes into a notch and around a tension spring, and there is an adjustment screw on that tension spring. So if you have problems with your adjustment of your tension, that's one area where you can adjust it. Usually you'll adjust it on the tension adjustment on the top of the machine, and I'll explain more on that in just a moment. So to load the bobbin, it goes in underneath the machine into its receptacle, and then you don't really have to pull the thread up. It'll usually pick it up on its own, but to make sure that everything's working correctly, if you hold tension on the thread end from the top thread that's gone through the needle, and then roll the hand wheel so the needle goes down, if you pull on the end of the thread, once you're at the top, you'll see the other thread from the bobbin come out, and you can pull that out. I just use a pair of scissors or whatever I happen to have handy to slide through to pull the end out, and then you can pull that out, and you have both thread ends. And I like to have them resting at the back of the machine when I start sewing.